morning, everyone. My name is Yolokazi Mfutho. I am based in Pretoria, and I'm very honored to host such an important event, particularly at a time where we are closing the last day of August, celebrating women. Please do excuse my voice. I'm catching flu, so there's something off with my voice. However, we're going to soldier on. Thank you. So now we're going to call on Prof. Oh, the breath is catching up on me. We're going to call a Prof to actually welcome us all and tell us why are we having a third webinar today, whilst I catch my breath.
Thank you, Yolokazi. Good day to every one of us and my distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. I'm Olubukola Oloranti Babalola. I'm based at the Northwest University in South Africa. I'm a member of ASSAf. It is a great honor for me to present before you today on behalf of the Academy of Science South Africa and to address you on a critical and timely topic on women's political participation and representation in our beloved country. Our constitution, often celebrated as one of the most progressive in the world, it enshrines the principles of equality and non-discrimination, and it provides a huge foundation for women's rights. This legal framework has been instrumental in creating an environment where women can actively participate in the political process. As of 2019, South Africa was a global leader in women's representation in our national parliaments. Women constitute nearly half of the National Assembly and a significant portion of the National Council of Provinces. This level of representation is not only a testament to our commitment to gender equality, but also a reflection of the dedication, the resilience of South African women. Political parties must make strides to ensure that all parties are equally committed to gender parity. Women's influence is not confined to legislative bodies. It is also extends as far as executive branch. Women hold significant position within the cabinets, where they have taken the helm of critical portfolios such as international relations, defense, and public enterprise. Furthermore, women have served as premier of provinces, as mayors of our cities, and they are providing leadership at every level of government. So you'll find that women played a critical role in anti-apartheid struggle, and the role of women and their contribution were recognized in the post-apartheid era to the extent that the adoption of the Constitution in 1996 included provisions for gender equality. So women have held significant positions in the government, including being deputy president, holding ministerial position, and just to mention a few. South Africa's journey towards gender equality in the political sphere has been envied by others, yet it also reminds us of our ongoing work that is required to achieve true parity, because that is our aim. So despite these achievements, women in South Africa politics, they still face challenges such as gender-based violence, discrimination, and unequal access to resources. At the local government level, women's representation in the municipal council is seen as progress. However, the challenges that is there in terms of facing patriarchal attitude, economic barrier, threats of violence and intimidation, these challenges are even more pronounced for women from marginalized community. Yet, we are not without support, I must say it. South Africa's vibrant civil society and organizations like ASSAf continue to advocate for women's rights and is pushing for more excellent representation in all spheres of political life. These efforts are bolstered by her commitment to international agreements, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and even regional framework like the SADC Protocol on Gender and Development. So today, as we gather here, let us acknowledge the progress that we have made and at the same time recognize the road that lies ahead. We must continue to nurture the next generation of women leaders. Break down the existing barriers and even ensure that our gains in gender equality are sustained and inclusive. So on behalf of ASSAf, I would like to express our commitment to supporting and advancing the cause of women's political participation and representation in South Africa. For that, I would say let us build a future where women's voices are heard, where it is valued, where it is celebrated in every corner of our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And you couldn't close it any better. In South Africa right now, we always celebrate women on the 9th of August and say they are doing amazing work for South Africa. However, this becomes an event, but the women who continue to struggle each day, they are never celebrated and they never get reaped the rewards, particularly in political spaces. Colleagues, so as we are going to go into our presentations, I have a few house rules that at least if you have a question, ensure that you write it on the chat box. We are going to attend to it, and then we are going to answer them after all presentations have been done. Secondly, please keep all our mics muted and our videos. Now we are going to call upon Professor Muller, who's going to offer us a keynote address to actually dissect the current state, a landscape of political participation in relation to women in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation. It's a real honor for the HSRC to be co-hosting this webinar with ASSAf, and it's a very valuable partnership to us. So I'm going to give an overall view of women's political participation and leadership in South Africa. And I had some technical problems on my side, so Marvin is going to help me with the presentation itself. I'm also going to switch off my camera during the presentation. Apologies for that, but I'm reading on another screen and I don't want to distract anyone. So let's continue. Thank you. Marvin, yes, thank you very much. So we're looking at serious issues here. I mean, that's something that's very clear. It's important for us to recognize women leaders within the South African context. And here I have a quote from a former first woman deputy president, Mlambo Ngcuka, where she says gender equality is not a cute thing, as some people make it out, but it is fundamental for the survival of normal society. I cannot imagine a government without women. So this is a bird's eye view, and it comes from Gender Links. They did some extremely good electoral research over the past years, focusing on women and gender. And I'll be touching in more detail on some of these things. I think you can see there members of parliament, that percentage has fallen from 2019 to 2024. and I'll give you an explanation for that. Women in the National Council of Provinces, that fell in 2019, but it is still relatively good in 2024, and it's increased by 8 percentage points since 2019. The picture doesn't look so great for women in provincial legislatures, going to 38, which is a lot lower, in particular since 2019. Women in cabinet, President Ramaphosa got it to 50% in 2019 and fallen to 44% this year. Deputy ministers are at 40%. Women premiers, there are very, very few of those, and I'm also going to be touching on wards. But you can see there's been a drastic decline in women premiers, and one would wonder why. Because 55% of voters are women, and the turnout for women is higher than men at 58%. And something I won't discuss in a lot of detail, but an interesting fact here is women as news sources. It's low. And it was particularly low in the last election. And that's very surprising and not very good, because we need to hear from women about women. So women in national government, I'm going to be looking at some of the statistics in the next few slides. So the important thing is achieving gender equity or equality in positions of decision-making is crucial to providing women with responsibilities for planning, making decisions, recommending policy, and coordinating empowerment efforts, including looking at the budgets, for example. So the scenario was very bleak prior to 1994, as we would all expect, with only 2.7% of members of parliament being women. This changed substantially after the 1994 elections, where the ANC proposed a 30% quota for women, and 27% of the seats in the National Assembly were won by women, while in the provincial legislature, women comprised 24%. This meant that the combined total of women in government in South Africa after 1994 was just over 26%, compared to 11% globally. So we looked good globally, but it still isn't good enough. In the 1999 elections, 30% of the National Assembly was women, and this has increased to 43% in 2024. So women's representation, as I've indicated to you, has declined in parliaments. And then in terms of the executive, the current 77 ministers, which includes ministers and deputy ministers, they make up 44% for ministers and 40% for deputy ministers. The ANC was one of the few parties that retained gender parity in its nominations, in its party lists, and currently has 53% of its MPs as women. The Economic Freedom Front has even more women represented in parliament at 54%. And I think this is interesting because the EFF does come across as a very masculine party. But with the ANC's loss of aggregate electoral support, the number of women dropped because some of the opposition parties do not have a gender quota. And I'll illustrate that to you a little bit later. So the ranking of women in national parliaments, this is from UN Women as of the 1st of February this year. We were ranked at 13%. With 44.4 women in our national parliaments. And you can see there we can compare ourselves to some of the SADC countries that are listed there. We fare well, but Rwanda, for example, is also doing quite well, and Zimbabwe has improved substantially over the past years. So I just wanted to look at South Africa within SADC. South Africa is performing extremely well in terms of the elections, and this is from the SADC Gender Monitoring report. And the increase has been steady enough for us, and I see that Mozambique and the Seychelles, although the Seychelles has dropped substantially, and Angola has also dropped. So the upward trajectory in South Africa is still there. Right, ministers, cabinet ministers, this has dropped. As indicated previously, it was much higher in 2019, but we are looking at 44 women as ministers and 40% of women as deputy ministers. It is interesting, though, to note the departments that women head, and that's something to note. So I'm turning to the political parties now. It's not a very pretty picture for most political parties. So the ANC and the EFF have a quota system for their party lists, and therefore their nominations are high, both provincially and regionally, although it is lower regionally. Then we get to the UDM, which has a reasonable amount of nominations at the National Assembly level, but regional, we can see there are only 28. So none of the opposition parties really do well in terms of especially regional representation on the party lists. And of course, many of these women on the party lists do not make it to Parliament. So how many female and male members of Parliament by political party do we have in 2024? Good, of course, we have one, and we all know who she is. The Patriotic Alliance, very interestingly, has many more women in Parliament than men. And I was quite surprised by that. The EFF and the ANC are very close together. ATM and BOSA and NCC all have 50%. And then we get to the parties who have many more men than women in Parliament. And that would be MK, Action SA, DA, IFP, and then in the last row, those are single seats, all occupied by men. The picture is slightly different for women in provincial government, and it obviously varies from province to province. The two provinces that do not have a very good representation of women, both in 2019 and 2024, but it's dropped even further, are the last two there. The Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, dropping from over 40% to just 30% or 31% as it is reflected there. And Limpopo also dropped quite radically. So there we can see the provincial legislatures don't look very good in terms of gender representation. Then premiers and speakers, we have many more male premiers than speakers, premiers than female premiers. And you can see that there are only 2 provinces have female premiers, and that is the Free State and KwaZulu-Natal. And then, but the picture changes when it comes to speakers. So there are more female than male speakers, with only 2 men as speakers in the Free State and in the Western Cape. But you can see there the Western Cape, led by the DA, both a male and a male premier and a male speaker. Our regional ranking is favorable But according to UN Women, the political participation of women in African parliaments has only risen from 24% in 2021 to 25% in 2024. And at this rate, we'll have to wait until the next century to achieve gender parity in our parliaments. Women in local government, this isn't a very pretty picture. Some quick observations. The voters' roll shows that women made up more than half of all registered voters, and that women's turnout was higher in the municipal or the local government elections at 58%. And nationally, men are more likely to hold mayoral positions than women, and in the Western Cape and Gauteng, there was the lowest representation of female mayors. The lowest representation of women councillors is observed in the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, and women not only account for fewer PR candidates than men, but are really seriously underrepresented in the ward elections. So only just over 27% of wards are led by women. And this is something that we need to look at seriously, because this is where the grassroots are. And so we need women to be closer to the grassroots and closer to service delivery at this level. So the lowest representation across the municipalities is in the Western Cape. And then you can see there the two, Limpopo and Mpumalanga. Free States, the representation is 57% because Mangaung is at 95% female representation or representation of women. And I would love to look at this more closely. And then Gauteng at 42% and the Eastern Cape at 40%. If we look at management representation, it is better than the general labor force. So the general labor force, 42% of women, so that is across the public and private sector. But local government representation is at 39%. Although these aren't elected positions, they are still women in government in leadership positions. So I thought it would be quite important to look at the place of the judiciary, and the information that I got from the most recent information from Judges Matter. So the number of female judges increased. The first female woman was appointed in 1994, and that was Constitutional Court Justice Yvonne Mokgoro, who sadly passed away recently. So the number of female judges in 2018 increased, and women made up 1/3 of the judiciary, which was a much better position for us to be in. In 2022, the Constitutional Court had 9 permanent judges. There should be 11. Only 33% of this bench was made up of women, so 1/3. The Supreme Court of Appeal has nearly half of its bench being women, which is really good. And the other superior courts, high courts, are looking reasonably okay, with 40% of the judiciary at this level being women. Then magistrates, over 51% of magistrates are women, and I think that is extremely good. Although you can see magistrates are sort of at the lower level, and one then thinks perhaps there is an issue here in that there should be more women in the Constitutional Court, Supreme Court of Appeal, and high courts. So Justice Mandisa Meyer will be South Africa's first woman Chief Justice from the 1st of the month, 1st of September. And she's the 5th woman to sit on a 15-member Heads of Court Forum. So that's an achievement. 1/3 of the Heads of Court Forum is made up of women, and the Regional Court and Chief Magistrates Forum are currently over 50%. Some main trends. So women constituted 27% of the National Assembly in 1994, approximately. Number of members of parliament is 43% in this year, and we ranked 13 globally in 2024 for our parliamentary representation. Cabinet representation was at an all-time high for women at 50% in 2019, but it has now dropped. Provincial level representation it's a mixed picture, and we certainly would like to see the number of premiers in particular, as well as members of provincial parliaments increasing. Local governments, again, it doesn't look very nice. Overall gender representation was 39%. In 2021, however, there's only 27% of wards are led by women. Party-specific trends. The opposition parties are pulling down the percentage in parliament. So the DA, MK, and IFP all range between 29 and 35% representativity. And in the judiciary, women's representation on the bench ranges from 1/3 at the level of the Constitutional Court to 51% at the magisterial level. What does the public think about representation? This is from our South African Social Attitude Survey, and we do the survey for the Electoral Commission. Every election, we do the voter participation survey, where we ask about people's intention to vote. And then we also do the election satisfaction survey on the day of the elections, which determines whether the commission perceives and decides that the elections were free and fair, along with a whole lot of other inputs. So there was a question here. Men are generally better politicians than women. 37% of men in red agree with that statement. 28% of women agree with that statement, which is a pity, because women should be confident enough that they know that they would be good politicians and that men would not be better than women in terms of politics. And you can see there's a number of unsures there as well in the gray. The next one is representation and responsiveness. If there were more women in politics, my needs would be better addressed. Now, this is interesting because 46% of men agree with this statement and 69% of women agree with this statement. So it's quite a large proportion of the population at 58% who believe that their needs would be met if women were in politics. The views on quotas, this is interesting because I've been dealing with numbers this whole time. Quotas for women in political parties should be increased. You can see there's a high favorability rate there for both men and women, but women being quite a lot higher. And then the next one is legislation should force parties to have women on their lists. And you can see there's a lot of support for this statement as well. So when it comes to the political parties and quotas, I think South Africans are quite in favor of quotas for party lists. So is representation by numbers enough? No, in my view, quotas and numbers are not enough. There also needs to be a mind shift, and women's voices need to be taken seriously. Purely because a woman is in a leadership position does not mean that what she does is good for other women or men in society. So serious challenges have persisted and particularly gender-based violence and femicide, which the president called a pandemic. So despite good policies and legislation, an increase in numbers, the national gender machinery that operates in this country and presidential attention, we aren't seeing this serious issue being addressed. The national gender machinery is a comprehensive and integrated set of structures in South Africa within the state, including the Autonomous Commission for Gender Equality, CGE. So, but there's an issue here, and I think some former commissioners from the CGE have mentioned this in literature. A number of them have said that the politicization of women's rights and feminism has degraded the national gender machinery. And it's a serious thing to say, but there is some support for this. Angie Motshekga, previous president of the ANC Women's League, publicly denied that they were a feminist organization that was hostile to male leaders. And this is upon the assumption that other women may be feminists and hostile to male leaders. And then the other thing that I think hits the women's movement quite a bit was the establishment of the Department for Women, Youth and People with Disabilities. It was institutionalized by our former president, Jacob Zuma, and it was at the cost of some other structures, leaving the women's movement fragmented and ineffective. So even though we have good numbers, we still have a situation where women's voices are not fully represented and heard in South African politics. And this is perhaps a controversial thing to say, but there's a lot of literature that backs this up. So a book was written by Amanda Goos in 2022 about the national gender machinery and the Commission for Gender Equality. And she says the picture is a complex one. While descriptive representation puts South Africa at the top 13% of countries with women's representation in the world, it falls short of delivering on policy. Implementation has always been a problem. And she mentions gender-based violence. As long as liberation movements in Africa turned political parties after liberation struggles do not live up to the demands of constitutional democracy, women will not reap the benefits that they are entitled to. So she's referring here to the Constitution and human rights and the importance of that in society and in the political domain. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mula. That was a very incredible, elaborate, thought-provoking presentation. I do hope that you are noting your comments on the chat box and your questions, because it's quite important that you also interrogate the positions that women get as speakers, premiers, and the powers they hold as well. Now we are going to go straight into our next presentation from Professor Jolene Steyn-Coetzee, who's going to give us also the state of women's participation in politics in South Africa, looking both at achievements and things that we can improve of. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to get my presentation going, which would help if I just click share screen. Share. Okay. I do believe my screen is visible now. Is that correct?
Yes, Prof, it's visible. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do today to follow up on Professor Bola Miller's overview of women's representation within the spheres of government as well as judiciary, and around some public perceptions on support for women's participation and women's empowerment and political representation, I thought there's a conversation that tends to happen around gender norms that we are not really engaging in when we start looking at questions of what I have titled agendered politics, gender norms and political participation. And there's quite a number of questions and I think interesting observation and tensions that arise when we start looking at gender norms. We need to bear in mind that when we look at politics, politics is inherently about power. And that power includes the ability to make decisions, whether it be political decisions, whether it be economic decisions, social decisions, community decisions, family decisions. The reality is that how men and women make decisions in everyday life remains highly political. Women very often have to make decisions within a family structure, for example, where cultural norms and gender norms may not necessarily support the decision that she is making. And it is quite important to remember that social norms do shape women's lived realities daily. And this would, of course, include their political lives, their socio-political lives, as well as their socio-economic lives. In 2018, George noted from the Gender Social Norms Index report that a woman's ability to engage politically both within and beyond the voting booth, particularly as community organizers and elected officials, is often shaped by norms that drive wider social structures. And she notes that women face an important reality of what she has entitled a triple burden of reproductive, productive, and community work, which in turn is shaped by gendered social norms that bolster expectations about women's roles and that influences women's ability to run for office and participate politically. And Professor Bowler-Miller made an very important point in terms of being mindful of when we look at female ministers and what ministries it is that they are leading. Are they leading traditionally feminine ministries, for example, education and health, or are they leading what would be generally masculine roles or ministries, for example, defense and economic planning? Globally, however, as the social norms, the Gender Social Norms Report of 2023 noted, women do remain underrepresented in all spheres, and they have noted quite a number of barriers, which include structural barriers that would entail, for example, access to education, access to microfinancing to start their own business for entrepreneurial activity, access to land, and various other structural barriers that may impact on a woman's political, economic, and social activity. And these structural barriers are often driven by social norms and stereotypes. And within the political space, masculine voices and who people regard as speaking with authority are generally those masculine voices that have authority to speak on important political, economic, and social questions. So with this very brief overview in mind, I went and took a look at the Gender Social Norms Index, which very briefly here measures a number of dimensions in order to come up with a score for a country. Sorry, I'm just trying to minimize my screen here so that I can see the entire presentation. There we go. So politically, the question is women having the same rights as men is essential for democracy. Men make better political leaders than women do. And Professor Bowler-Miller has touched on the 2023 numbers. Educational, university is more important for men than women. Economic, men should have more right to a job than women. Men make better business executives than women do. And then physical integrity, questions around abortion is never justifiable, so reproductive rights, and gender-based violence, is it justifiable for a man to beat his wife? And when we start looking at the Gender Social Norms Index, the numbers are quite interesting, I found. So if we look at the share of people with at least one gender bias, quite high, with at least two gender biases, also quite high, and the number of people with no gender biases, according to the Gender Social Norm Index in South Africa, remains quite low. What I did find interesting, however, was that there were quite our numbers in terms of gender bias within the political dimension as well as the physical integrity dimension is quite high. And I think especially for the physical integrity dimension, when we start looking at the rate of gender-based violence and femicide, this is an area that is going to need some serious attention around norms that may, for lack of a better phrase, justify gender-based violence or guide behavior around gender-based violence. What I did find interesting was that when we start looking at rights to education, as well as economic activity, there is quite a sharp distinction between the political dimension and the economic dimension vis-a-vis the educational dimension of values that may undermine gender parity and gender representativity and participation. So I also went and took a look at the questions that the Gender Social Norms Index use, which is in the World Values Survey. Unfortunately, the only data available is for the rounds 2010 to 2014. And again, we note that, you know, it is concerning that approximately 39% of the South African population thought university education is more important for a boy than a girl, coupled with approximately 30% that men should have more right to a job, and 52% agreeing that men do make better political leaders than women, and coupled with that, of course, men make better business executives than women do. So we can see that there's definitely gender biases that do drive, or gender norms, or and the structure of gender roles. And I would also argue the construction of femininity according to those gender norms and societal norms that drive perceptions around access, around participation, and around who is, again, for lack of a better phrasing, worthy of having a university education or having more of a right to a job. And I think that tends to play into some conservative constructions around gender, for example, men as provider, women as nurturers within society. So when we look at the World Values Survey for that period, there are a number of key points or key conclusions that we can draw from that around gender and political leadership, for example. While the view is not overwhelmingly dominant according to the World Values Survey, a slight majority do believe that men are better political leaders than women. In terms of employment right, there seems to be a recognition for equal employment rights, and similarly, a stronger belief in equal education opportunities for both genders, so both men and women. Business leadership, interestingly enough, was, as the data demonstrates, a contentious issue in that it's closely divided, 49 agreeing and 48 disagreeing, showing that there might be some nuances that drive perceptions around a woman's business acumen. So in essence, the big conclusion that one can draw from the World Values Survey is that although there is a notable push towards gender equality, especially in employment rights, we do find some gender biases still present, specifically in terms of business leadership as well as political leadership, even though there is a strong preference for gender equality in employment and education. And I do find those tensions quite interesting, because on the one hand, you are supporting gender equality in employment, but on the other hand, you are also divided on whether you believe women make good business leaders or not. To explore this question a little bit further, I looked at the IEC Voter Participation Survey 2015, which is a very valuable data set, and I would encourage all participants to go and download the data and have a look and play around a little bit with the data, because it really does give you some key insights, not just around women's political behavior or men's political behavior, but just general voter attitudes in particular. So the set of questions, and Professor Bowler-Miller has touched upon them a little bit in her presentation now, that I looked at as well in this particular data set to kind of see how we compared with the World Value Survey, was questions around political competence. So men make better political leaders than women. Coupled with that is the question, of course, I will never vote for a woman. Gendered voting preferences, gendered influence on political choice. So does a man have the right to tell a woman how to vote, or does a woman have the right to tell a man how to vote or who to vote for? Representation and needs. So that would be the question around, my needs would be better met if we had more women in politics, or my needs would be better met if we had more men in politics. Support for gender quotas, and then support for female political involvement. So again, when we start looking at the voter participation survey, we find that there is a little bit of a contested picture that emerges when you look at the VPS data vis-a-vis the World Value Survey data, for example, where only 29% of the population said that they do believe men are generally better politicians, that men have 81% and 82% are very, very much in favor of political autonomy, or the right to autonomy in political choices. With regards to needs being met, it's again quite interesting to note the numbers around, if more women were there or if more men were there, and of course support for legislation and quotas. So when we start looking at what we can garner from both the World Value Survey as well as the Voter Participation Survey of 2015, there are the perceptions on political competence is that there's a definite recognition of women's political capabilities, but those lingering gender biases on political competence do remain. Gendered voting preferences, it is worrying that let's say almost a fifth, so around 18% then indicated that they would never vote for a woman, while the majority disagreed. So there is an acceptance of women candidates, but even though there's an acceptance, there are biases that still persist within the voting public, which of course may then play out in terms of representativity that we find at a local government level or through ward councillors or PR councillors. We've noted there's strong support for autonomy and political choice. And we've also noted that the area around female representation and its positive policy impact to deal with issues more effectively also remains somewhat contested. There is support for gender quotas, and a large majority of people believed that increased female involvement in politics is necessary to address gender issues. So what is interesting for me is that when we start looking and we dig a little bit deeper, and I ran the data through an independent t-test to try and determine whether there are some gender differences. There were statistically significant differences on questions of political competence, representation and needs, gender quotas, and support for political involvement. And interestingly enough, on political competence, I was hoping the data would demonstrate that men are more negative about male leadership than they are about female leadership, a little bit like women drivers and men drivers. But men were more positive about their own leadership vis-a-vis women who are more positive about their own leadership. So I think those 4 areas would be key in terms of future research, and also maybe future training programs, as well as looking at some form of policy innovation around gender norms for political competence, representation and needs, quotas, and support for political involvement. Just very interesting what I picked up as well from the World Values Survey around political involvement is women's movements and how confident people are in terms of the ability of women's movement to have an impact. And we also note from the World Values Survey that it is quite a contested picture. And I think what was interestingly enough is the gender split, where only 34% vis-a-vis 33% of male and females felt they had quite a lot of confidence, 15 and 19% a great deal, 28 and 27 not that much. So I think there are several lessons that come to the fore when we start looking at the broader picture of gender norms that we can learn from the IEC voter participation survey series, as well as the gender social norms index. And I'm quickly going to run through this because I think I am out of time. So what I tried to do was to come up with some innovative and creative ways on one, what could be a policy innovation, and on the other hand, what could be future research areas or critical areas that we need to look at. So the first one would be looking at educational programs, public awareness campaigns that could include voter education, looking at life skills within schools as well, around women's politician and stereotypes about gender and political competence. And I've put in brackets there the example of bad girls. As we heard in Parliament, the advice given to new women who were coming in as MPs was, don't be a good girl, be a bad girl, because good girls cannot make it. And I found that quite interesting. There is a need to understand the root of gendered bias in political competence, and also to start assessing the effectiveness of various interventions aimed at changing these perceptions within the South African schooling system, as well as the voter education program. In terms of representation and need, there is a perceived link between representation and effective policy making. And there, for me, it would be important to assess the impact of increased female representation on policy outcomes, as well as constituent satisfaction through studying the relationship between gender diversity and the prioritization of specific issues. For female political involvement, it is important to create programs that support and mentor women interested in political careers, but also to extend the networks to facilitate women's engagement in politics at various levels, to examine the barriers of female political participation, evaluate how effective various interventions can be. And of course, the impact, as I've mentioned, of increased female involvement on policy development and public opinion. And lastly, given the consistent level of skepticism or indifference towards women's movements and their ability to have an impact, it is important to start looking at creating campaigns as well as networking or social compacts, if you will, that can engage both men and women in discussions and activities related to women's movement. This can help broader support and understanding around, I would argue, the notion that feminism is not just a feminine issue, but a masculine issue as well. And that is my concluding thought, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was a very important discussion. And also maybe we can look deeper when in our discussions towards the end on also the erasure of women in history and how it affects the gendered politics that we're having today. Now we're going to move right straight to Simangazo Mokale to give us a presentation on changes that women can make institutionally to ensure that there is proper decision making and they change the actual landscape on how things go in institutions of Ireland, in institutions generally. Smagaso, thank you.
Good. Is it still good morning?
Yes, 4 minutes
Yes,
left.
yes. Good morning, Program Director. Thank you. A fellow panelist, thank you for joining us for this brief presentation that I'm gonna make. It is indeed an honor for me to have been invited to join such a distinguished panel to share my thoughts on this topic of the role of women in affecting institutional changes to address the challenges women encounter in the decision-making spectrum. When we speak of institutional changes, we speak of institutions such as our homes, the workplace, or even the church. And we have seen in the past 30 years of our democracy, we have seen a shift in terms of how women are taking space in all of those areas. We've seen how our homes and women's voice have echoed, and the dynamics of the house or the household has changed. We look at our workplaces as well. We can see that there's a shift when it comes to women representation. This sentence that is indeed a mouthful, but within it lies a key question that women continue to encounter in our daily lives. And in the year that marks our 30 years of democracy and freedom, which is such an incredible milestone for our democratic system. But as we near the closure of Women's Month, it would be remiss if we do not acknowledge the role of women in the struggle for freedom and our society at large. The women who marched to the Union buildings in 1956 will forever live in our collective consciousness. Their courageous deeds in resisting the unjust rule of an illegitimate system and the oppressive burden imposed by discrimination based on race, social status, and gender continues to echo through time. Their march was driven by the pursuit of freedom, equitable representation that we had just been talking about now, and our professors have given us a clear picture of where we are. Land entitlements and unrestricted access to the judicial systems. We remember there was a time where women didn't have any access to land, and when you were married to a man and the man passes away, you couldn't own the land, or you couldn't own a home. But with democracy, all of these things have changed. Now women are able to fight for their homes. They are able to fight for their rights. And we can see that so much has shifted since then. And it's all because of the women who began this road in 1956. Their actions laid the platform for the society we enjoy today. However, it was not always so. The stark reality is that 30 years ago, numerous sectors excluded women from occupying leadership roles, reserving only certain vocations such as nursing, teaching, and secretarial work as suited for women. Put simply, their role was intended for the kitchen rather than the boardrooms. With these women, please go back a bit, just the last part. Is we see that the nurses of yesterday and the teachers have produced the type of women today we see in our TVs, we see in our economy, that we see all over in our country, where these women who come from these backgrounds are really making a stride and are making a huge difference, and they are shining all over the world. So all of this, the initial thought was that we are just going to be these three, minimal workers. But today we see that those steps, even though they were not, you didn't have the opportunity to do other stuff, but it created an open doors for the younger children who were watching their mothers going to work, for those who were watching their mothers doing, this minimal work. It made them to want to dream big and to do more. So as we stand at this critical juncture of 30 years of democracy and freedom, we are provided an opportunity to reflect on the progress we have made while assessing the challenges that women still face. It is also true that every generation faces a unique set of challenges, yet many things remain universal. The concerns of women in the 50s revolved around practical and essential topics, sometimes referred to as bread and butter issues, including housing, food prices, and permits. But contemporary South Africa presents women with a diverse array of challenges, including domestic violence, child abuse, HIV/AIDS, unemployment, gender discrimination, and poverty. The women in the 50s, we can make an example of our grandmothers and probably our mothers as well, who didn't have, who only concentrated on the home and the few careers that they were offered, but mostly it was the bread and butter issues, as alluded there. So today we are faced with a whole lot of challenges that sometimes these two generations somehow we don't have, we can't see eye to eye, because they lived in a different generation, and the issues that we have today somehow were there, but were not as big as we are experiencing today. It is therefore important that we all stand together to address remaining challenges with the same resilience and spirit of the women who stood against the apartheid system. Please go up. Okay. Colleagues, these days, there are many who question the value of our democracy. I am, however, of the view that the country has made significant progress in advancing women in our country. All these women, we pride ourselves with, that we see, who have made strides. I think of former Deputy President Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who has put our name, out there as South Africa, and she has done a remarkable job in advocating for women's rights all over the world. And so women have assumed leadership roles in all sectors of society, such as the judiciary, government, and the business sector. And furthermore, women can now be found in such sectors such as aviation, the military, and others that were once considered the sole preserve only for men. And when we look at the stats now, we look at how the judiciary has changed over the years. As we speak today, we have of the 253 judges in the Superior Constitutional and Supreme Court, there are 113 women who are judges presently. And in our government, we also see that the 46% of parliamentary seats are occupied by women. But there was a slight decrease this year because of the national elections outcome, where we went down by 43. We went down to 43%. When we look in the business sector, we have female CEOs that increased this year from the 30% to 39%. And then we move over to the aviation, where of the 25,830 numbers, only 5,067 are female. These include pilots, engineers, air traffic officers, and cabin crew. It's an improvement that we must all celebrate. In our military, there has been 26.6%, a bit of a challenge there, but there are still, because of the patriarchal attitudes that still persist in that sector, but the numbers are growing as well, where we see many young girls deciding to go into military. And so we made the strides because of the many brave women who came before us and changed the narrative of what a woman's role should be. Again, we have Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who, after she became our first deputy president, went to serve as the executive director of the UN Women and continued representing and advocating for women's rights. Another young woman who is making strides at the UN is Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to health, where she campaigns for universal health access and HIV care. These are just a few examples of how this country has produced women with integrity who are now advocating the rights of women all over the world. Just recently, we also witnessed the historic appointment of Justice Maya as the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court. Her appointment is an affirmation of power of women. It represents a major milestone in the transformation of our judiciary and comes as we mark 101 years since women were allowed to practice as legal practitioners. While more women today have access to opportunities across the spectrum, there are still many challenges that continue to hold them back. According to the UN Sustainable Goals Study, it will take us 140 years for women to be represented equally in positions of power and leadership in the workplace. So this gives us a challenge, and it means we must push even more for women representation. The imbalances are clear, and men continue to dominate the labor market, especially at the management level. Therefore, as women, we must continue to ensure that work to level the playing field continues, including the creation of progressive laws that are dedicated to development of women in our country. These include laws dedicated to gender equality, which seek to eliminate discrimination in employment, training, and recruitment based on gender. Laws such as Employment Equity Act, which enjoins employers to work towards more equitable representation based on gender, race, and disability, have helped in this regard. These instruments have helped to ensure greater gender representation, but on their own, they are not enough. It is up to all in society to ensure that we create the right conditions for equal participation in the economy and in all spheres of life. The one issue that is still needs work is overcoming the many hurdles women often encounter in the decision-making spectrum. these could be structural or in the culture of the organization of business. Whatever it may be, when a woman is impeded from being fully functional, we should all be concerned. Even though we have come a long way since 1994, work still remains, and we must therefore continue to challenge the societal norms and work together against biases and cultural expectations that often perpetuate gender stereotypes and create systematic hurdles for women aspiring leadership roles. As women, we must continue to push to shatter the proverbial glass ceiling by demanding that stakeholders, policymakers, organizations, and individuals implement diversity and inclusion initiatives. This goes hand in hand with the promotion of equitable hiring practices and creating supportive workplace cultures. These are all important if we are to dismantle the systematic barriers to women's leadership. As we celebrate 30 years of freedom and democracy, it is incumbent on everyone to do more to ensure that women are empowered so we can grow our economy and indeed change lives of women for the better. Just as women in the past took the lead in shaping their destiny, today women must be at the forefront of reshaping societal norms. Going forward, let us partner together and find ways to harness the potential of women to drive the economy and to ensure more inclusive and sustainable development. And that is my 10 minutes of my speech there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simakato, for that wonderful presentation. Indeed, it's important that you continue to have the intergenerational dialogues. And most importantly, for women to know that things can be done, they must see women do things. So this is a very good presentation. Now we are heading straight to our last presentation. We're going to have Dr. Mfano Zelwe Shozi presenting for us her initiatives to promote gender equality. Doc?
Thank you very much. The machine is playing games here. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will, the one who loved last, I'm not
Yes.
sure who loved best, I think most people have said maybe almost everything. I'm going to be thank you, Program Director, and thank you very much for inviting me. Let me just come the slide and this one. I think there's a lot that has been presented in terms of the stats and everything. But let me just talk about the gains. You know, these would be gains in some people, but in some won't be gains. But I think I'm putting gains because it's important for us when we advocate to think about these issues. All of us, we know we have a constitution in this country. There's calls for equality, equal protection, benefit before the law, and non-discrimination. So that's very, very important because we have that. Other countries, they're struggling. They don't have the constitution like ours. But at least we can maneuver around and hold our government accountable and everybody else accountable. I think other speakers have spoken about the national policy framework on gender equality, the gender machinery, which will include an array of institutions to address social and economic marginalization of South African women. We have also a number of laws and policies in this country. And the last time I counted, they were close to 250. I was trying to put my video, but they're saying the host has denied the video. So now, I'm not sure what's happened to my slide. I'm not sure you can see it that side. I can't see it as vanished. Are you able to see my slide, host?
Yes, Doc, we can see your slide and we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. I'm not sure what's wrong. I can't see my slide from my side. Just hold on. I'll just stop sharing and share again.
Yes, please.
Just give me 1 second. Can you see my slide now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
All right.
The other issue is we have Employment Equity, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Fair Discrimination Act. We have equality courts, which I don't think we're using them as a country that much, which we need to use. We need to actually mobilize stakeholders to actually utilize these courts. The issue of recognition of customary marriages act, and other people, they feel then that in the sector, it's a very oppressive legislation. We must also look into it. And I think there was a bill, the Muslims marriages bill as well, which was never passed. We must also advocate around the finalization of that particular bill. The Sexual Offences Act, which I think was a huge improvement from the previous legislation, is really assisting and also to bring equality on board, even where it also gives definition, it broadens the definition of rape and others. And the Trafficking Act, the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Act. So there are so many others. We've actually rectified a number of international instruments like CEDAW, Beijing Platform for Action, the Protocol on Gender and Development, Maputo Protocol, and so many others, the Sustainable Development Goals. If you come from 1994, there are gains that there were no women, very few women in government and in politics before 1994, but there was an increase of women representation. But with the changing of political landscape, other parties who are not really focused on putting women in their list, who are not believing in quotas as a policy, who are really experiencing a problem. And I think it has been mentioned in a number of presentations that really we need to have a mandatory registration for political parties so that at least they are able to deal with this. We have active civil society that strive to hold the state to be accountable, but I think there's also a critical issue there that when we walk around, there's also rural boys, very few civil society organizations in the rural areas, in informal settlements. So we find them in the cities. And I think it's something that civil society should look into if indeed you want to advocate truly about gender equality matters and know exactly what is happening. Even consider even opening offices in these rural areas. So we must also walk the talk as civil society leaders. So I'm not sure what is happening here. I will just go. There are also persistent inequalities that continue to exist. One of those is gender-based violence and femicide. You know, women who are exposed to poverty. The 50-50 representation is also in trouble here. But I think what is also critical is the equality that we must also deal with. There are also institutional cultures, and I know people are also talking about the issue of the wage gap in South Africa and so on. And you'll find then that, for example, in government, there are about 16 notches, by TTG or ITG, there are 16 notches. And when you scrutinize deeply, you think that people are paid equally. but you will find that people are in different notches. So who decides about that? As much as there's legislation, but the people who appoint to decide whether or not one, notch 2, notch 3. So you will find that in most cases, women actually suffer being started on notch 1 and others are notch 6 or notch 7. So those are some of the critical issues that we must always engage as activists. I think our criminal justice system, the further you go into the rural areas, the poorer the justice system becomes, you know, even silver and everything. So very, very critical. So I was traveling to my rural home and I realized traveling from city to home, it takes to a rural area, it takes you longer. And those things, they speak directly the issues that relate to women and development. The issues of institutional culture, the criminal justice system, the LGBTIQ plus issues that relate to rural women and so on, very, very critical. So issues of tradition and culture, issues of ukuhlola, ukuthwala, ukungena, we must advocate around those issues. But there's also another critical issue that we must also raise in this country. We must not only, when we talk about gender equality matters, focus on African issues. We must also go into other cultures. What are the issues that deal with that we find in Chatsworth? That are the issues that we find in the Western Cape? What are issues that we find in the suburban areas? So that we are not shocked when gender discrimination happens, when violation of women's rights are happening in these particular areas. We must also understand the massification, manifestations of these issues in other cultures, because I think we tend to always, in most cases, focus on the African cultures. Yes, we must continue, make sure that we do that, we investigate, we research, we deal with those issues, we hold people accountable, but it's also important for us to learn about what is also happening. So I think issues of women's movement, they've also talking about that, issues of feminism as well, very, very critical. The systematic challenges that we encounter in gender, key development, and policy framework. Gender mainstreaming is a policy, but is not implemented. So can look at a number of issues. And the monitoring and evaluation as well mechanisms do not emphasize more on gender equality matters. It's important that we must also do that. People, I think other speakers before me, professors, have spoken about political. When political parties are also losing power, women are actually
It does look like we have lost Doc for a second. I think it's a technical glitch from his side. May we please give him a minute to come back? If not, we are going to head straight to our discussions.
I'm here, madam. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Doc. Please continue.
Okay, thank you. So I'm operating from Umlazi, so you must understand.
Yes, South Africa, we have a huge internet issue.
Our institution is at Umlazi. Thank you very much. And the issue of the key legislation is also critical. Initiatives to promote gender and advocate for gender equality challenges instances of discrimination, and I think we must advocate about these challenges, issues of citizenship, GBV on gay and lesbian issues, harmful practices, issues of widowhood, forced sterilization of HIV and positive women. These are some of the issues we must advocate around. We must really, I think we are very strong on making submissions on legislation, and I think we are now not doing those things. We must continue doing that. I remember during the traditional course bill, the Muslim marriages bill, the domestic partnerships bill, we were doing those things, and we must continue doing that because it genders the work of parliament. We must monitor gender equality in public and private sectors. So that will include institutions of higher learning, government departments, and so on and so forth. And I know that the Commission for Gender Equality has public hearings. We must support those so that we make sure institutions are actually accountable. You know, there's this thing that when political parties are going to hold their national conferences, we must get involved. When I was the chair of the CGE, I was writing to all of them and remind them about gender equality. That when they elect top 7 or top 5, women should be elected, not only being deputy secretaries, but being chairpersons, being treasury generals, and so on. So we must continue engaging, because those are the positions of power, as much as those are not government positions, but they really affect how women are going to be elected in positions of power. So if you can look at who has been put in the list of political parties, in most cases are people who are PC members, who are NEC members, and who are holding these positions. Therefore, it's important for us, when we advocate, we look into that. We must not leave private sector outside. It's critical that we must hold the private sector, because remember, we are clients, we are consumers of their products. So as much as they're saying it's their own private wealth, but they must be accountable about transformation, and they must be accountable and be able to actually share with us how they actually promoting gender equality and gender equality. So we must also engage with partners, you know, as NGOs and civil society organizations, Chapter 9, and government on gender equality matters. So we must engender our national planning. I think there are instruments that we can always use. One of the critical issues is, I know we always looking at gender-based violence, but I think we must also change the language now. We must all advocate for peace, have programs that are going to promote peace, making sure that in our homes there's peace, making sure that in schools there's peace. We must have programs that are going to actually identify key structures, and wherever we speak, we must always promote, make sure that we talk about, there's this positive word called peace, and we must always promote positive values. The moral regeneration movement, I know, is really dealing with that. So peace is also very critical in what we're supposed to do. That is approaches that we normally use. One of them is peaceful masculinities approach. Some they call it a theory and so on. But I think that approach, in most cases, most of the combatants in war are men, and they perpetrate most of the violence in times of peace. So we all move from the same premise that men are perpetrators of peace in the majority, of war and violence in the majority. So, however, men are not inherently violent. Therefore, this approach acknowledges that violence and violent conflict, including sexual and gender-based violence, have long-term impacts on men and boys, and therefore need to be addressed. We must have this addressing peaceful approach to assist us to talk to our men and boys. The peaceful masculinity approach shifts the narrative from the idea of men as inevitable perpetrators of violence to an understanding that masculinities are socially constructed and can be shaped around peace. So it's also important to talk about how we raise our boys. You know, have a conversation, men and women, about raising our boys, raising our future boys, so that they become boys who are not going to actually violate their sisters, their wives, their girlfriends, and so on. So that's one. And I think there is another an approach before I close. There's an alternative violence program, and most people know about it, but it teaches people about to expect best from people, to think before reacting, and so on. That program, and I know is run throughout South Africa, assists communities to be non-violent. And I think we must have those programs that are going to be community-based, to assist our communities from all stratas to understand peace and also to be non-violent. So we really need to make sure that we move towards a peaceful society. I wanted to share a reflection about my study, but I know that my time is actually labs now. Thank you very much, Program Director, for inviting me. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Doc. This was so important. And it's quite important that we teach the young boys, because if we are going to say boys must protect women from what? They must allow space for women. And no one should allow anyone any space, right? Every human being deserves a chance. Now we are going to go straight into discussions. But firstly, I have a question for Professor Mula. We don't have more questions on the chat box. Prof, in most cases globally, we've seen the erasure of women. We've seen men leading. We've seen their wives being the other part of the person. But when you look down into history, the type of work women have been doing have constantly been dismissed, have constantly been erased. How do you think that impacts the type of work that we do today to ensure gender equality and our fight for social justice?
Thank you so much for the question. And it's a very good question, because history is written by the victors. And a lot of our history has been written by men, about men. And so in the research space, it's often very difficult to obtain data and research information about women, historically and currently. So, there is a form of erasure in that. And that's why UN Women, for example, is establishing these exceptionally good databases, and Gender Links in South Africa is doing really good work around gender in elections. And so we have to keep growing our research base and our database so that we are including and not excluding women's voices, and not only listening to some women and not others. And reclaiming a lot of what we have done, and what we should be congratulated for as women. And yeah, you said earlier, nobody should be given space. No, we take the space. The space is ours. And so we must look towards kind of what's happening internationally with a bit of care, because we are seeing a shift internationally towards kind of like big man politics, and leaders who are not fond of women, if I can say the least. So we also need to take care of how we move forward, not only as South Africa, but as Africa and internationally.
Thank you so much, Prof. And yeah, that's quite formidable. Also, recently I was listening to a radio show, and Dr. Mampela Rampela was interviewed, and a caller says, "How was it working with Steve Biko?" And she's like, "We started Black Consciousness. I was there. I'm part of it. I was not his mentee. I'm his colleague." Right? So it's easier to forget women. Thank you so much, Professor. Now we're going to Prof. Kote. There's a question around women in rural areas versus the women in urban areas in terms of political participation. Do we see any differences?
I think it's always quite interesting when we start looking at urban vis-a-vis rural political participation and political dynamics, and I think the realities are somewhat different. So in terms of whether we see any differences, I think one will need to run the data to have a look to see if there are any statistical differences based on geographic location. But I also think we need to look at modes of mobilization, how women, for example, in rural areas are able to mobilize around the idea of a stokvel, for example, or are able to mobilize around the idea of a community garden, bearing in mind that within rural areas as well, when you start looking at access to services, access to basic services, access to education, are critical challenges and does form part of those structural barriers that women from rural areas might face, that women in urban areas might not necessarily face. I also think that when you start looking at the rural-urban divide, questions of values, of norms also start becoming more important. I think it will be quite interesting to test and see whether people, men as well as women in rural areas, tend to hold more conservative gender values and gender views when compared to urban areas. So I think there's a lot to be done around your urban-rural divide, around gender participation, gender norms, gender values. But I think it also needs to be placed within the context around questions of access and what the structural barriers are.
Yes, that's definitely correct. And for me, I'm from a rural area in particular. However, now because I'm in Pretoria, I see the different ways of organizing. The women in my area now, neighborhood watch meetings, boards and stuff. In the rurals, they discuss this in stokvels and stuff. However, the intensity of participation varies, right? So that, I think, is an area that must be explored, where we can look into how we intensify the participation and politicize people in the different spaces. Thank you so much, Prof. We are Smakazo, yeah? I'm going to ask a very particular question about the fact that in South Africa, we've had incredible public protectors as females 3 consecutive times. We have a good AG. We have speakers in parliament. We are seemingly doing progressively well. However, there's something that is still missing. Do you think that even women, when they're in these positions of power, do you think they still face hindrances in exercising their positioning? Makato?
Okay. It's Mangazo.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry. Yes, it's Mangazo. Yeah, I think they do. The point is, we are all still, the system is still very much a hindrance in certain instances. As much as we are pushing for, for those type of leadership, but the hindrance is in the system. I would like to believe. So the sooner we fight the system and try to change and move away from, the stereotypes, I think we're gonna win, but it's gonna take some time. I just think the system is the one that needs to be really, challenged a lot.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Yes, that's true. And sometimes I like pushing back against the concept of the system is, yes, things systematically, they tend to not favor women, right? However, you find out that the political appointments, they come with conditioning. So that then becomes a hindrance. Also, my question now, maybe any of the speakers can take it as we are heading to Dr. Afanosen. Why are we not having a female UN Secretary General? Is the point that we don't have competent women in the world, or is just a political will for people to lobby and support a woman? Maybe, Doc, you can take us through that.
No, look, for me, what is critical is that the world is very patriarchal. And it's patriarchal in the sense that whenever a woman is supposed to ascend in power, they will come up with excuses. And all of us, included, all genders, will support that excuse. You know, I'll just use one example of Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. When he was in the camp of Thabo Mbeki, it was an excuse. He didn't get in. When he was on the other camp, it was an excuse. It did not get in. You take the issue of the American elections as well. When Hillary Clinton was supposed to ascend to power, there were also issues. So there are so many other issues, you know, that will come and that will actually play itself out. And you ask yourself, we're in 30 years now with a beautiful constitution, why we've never had a deputy president? You know, the deputy president of women that we've had in the country, they were all appointed because a man has resigned or a man has left. We've never had a direct deputy president. So I can count them, you know. So it's important that we must hold, and women are in majority in this country. So all of us working together, but we know that politics is a poison chalice because of factions that will always come into this. But what I can tell you is the problem that we have as a country is that there's patriarchy and there's power. And the patriarchy in power will always be used to actually block women from ascendance to power. So there will be those. For example, let me just give you a good example. If men sometimes could just volunteer and say, no, I'm not available for this deputy president position. But they won't do that because it's very, very powerful. So those are some of the things. And look at when we go around and look at women vice chancellors as well. The challenges that they encounter, you know, just because they are women vice chancellors, women that are leading in the industry. So those are some of the things, and I think it's important that as a country and the world, we must also define when we put women there, because we always complain and also say once women are in power, they don't look back. The system does not allow them to look back. It's the system that prevents them from doing all those things. So let's also look at the system and the design of the system. Where does it really allow women to operate, which I don't think it does. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Doc, for that. And really, the politics generally are rooted in patriarchy, and it's a big man game, as Professor was saying as well. So it's quite important that all forces must be brought forward to ensure that we fight for this gender equality. But I saw a very interesting comment here, I'm not sure if I missed it, that Professor Catherine Gila says, I always believe that to address gender gaps, government, policies, governance encourages affirmative action and institutionalization of these policies for implementation. It's very important and close gender gaps. It's so important that we take it one step at a time and we ensure that we leave no stone unturned. Currently, we are going to move straight to Dr. Mokatso Mokai to offer us reflections and closing remarks.
Program Director, thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting us and to take part in this HSRC ASSAf event on this last day of August. I have been asked to provide some reflections, and give closing remarks to this important event. And I think I'm going to continue from where everybody has left, because when we listen to the different presentations, the speakers are providing a clear indication of where we come from and where the aspirations are lying. And I think it is about continuing that narrative. Thank you very much. Can you proceed, please? Next slide. So when we look at the journey and we look at what has concerned South Africa and Africa around issues of gender equality, we can tell that this is not a game, as Professor Bolamula was indicating earlier. Gender equality in political institutions, in structures, in systems and processes is key to Africa's progress, and therefore it is key to South Africa's process. And when we reflect on 30 years into democracy and women's political participation and representation, we must realize that we are talking about a very short history. But also, it gets even shorter when we consider the policy instruments that are guiding us in terms of how we should go about gender transformation and women's political participation and representation. When we look at these instruments, next slide, we realize that we have less than the 30 years that we are using as a time frame. When we look at the most recent, for example, Sustainable Development Goals, the SADC protocol that was referred to earlier, also the Maputo Protocol. These are very recent developments. They are not the ones that we can say have been here for a long time, and therefore we had enough time in terms of implementation. 10 years, for example, 15 years, that's not the same as 30 years, but at least we know that the Constitution is the most important tool, most important instrument that we have. And that at least with it, we have had it for close to 30 years. But what have we achieved with it? We find that the desired gender transformation in the political sphere, as it has already been indicated, is not easy to realize. And it's not easy to realize because it is something that involves not only changing institutions and practices, it is also about changing social norms. And we have seen from the previous presentations that it is not easy to change social norms, and that social norms are entrenched in the social systems that we are part of. And these social norms, sometimes we use them, and other times they are used against us. So the question that we want to ask is, are political institutions in South Africa as a democratic state, are they effective actors that address women's political underrepresentation as it has been portrayed this morning? And we realize that political parties and their decision-making structures, their internal processes, their legislatures, and the bureaucracy that functions along them are not necessarily providing effective instruments. We realize that there are shortcomings and we realize that there is still a need for improving the situation as it is. And there are obstacles, and these obstacles need to be taken into consideration. There is dependence on international policy frameworks, but there is not enough prioritization of domestication of these policy frameworks. And that hinders progress in terms of implementation. Previous speakers have indicated, for example, that there are no laws, there are no regulations that would support implementation and promote implementation of equality and gender equity. We rely on quotas, but political structures disregard some of these normative frameworks. For the longest time, CEDAW had this 30% aspirational norm for women's political participation. But we have just observed now that not every political party even considered that. Some political parties ensure 50% or parity, but many do not. And questions are hardly ever asked about why it's not happening. And there is women's disproportionate burden of unpaid care that is hardly ever referred to when we try to understand how best women can be enabled and supported to participate in political life. Earlier, we talked about triple burden of care, production, and reproduction. But there will always be limits in the sense that unpaid care remains a sole responsibility of women. And as a result of women being preoccupied with unpaid care, their participation in political life and also in economic life is limited. But we are also facing a situation of not recognizing differences that characterize women, the fact that women are not the same, the heterogeneity that needs to be taken into consideration. Earlier, the question was posed about rural and urban women. Are they the same? Their aspirations might be the same, but the obstacles will not be the same given their situations. So when we talk about not leaving anyone behind, at times it seems that we are leaving many behind. And we are still not considering diversity when it comes to participation, when it comes to representation. And these are some of the issues that play as obstacles in the representation and participation of women in political life. And we were made aware earlier that if we're talking about mobilization, if we are talking about citizen engagement, the local level plays a pivotal role, but we find that there is still a challenge when it comes to women working together in a unified way. And part of the reason has to do with spatial aspects of our lives, in the sense that even if communities can be close to one another, that proximity tends to be undermined by spatial boundaries that are historical. Next slide, please. But I want to think that from the presentations that we listened to this morning, there are prospects. Some representative institutions still prioritize gender equality, but we must also acknowledge that there are threats. There are threats to proportional representation. But because there are improvements in the education levels of women and girls, we can be hopeful that some of the obstacles that we are referring to, we see change in the sense that people are beginning to open up collaborations to participating and to also forming partnerships around issues that affect them on a day-to-day basis. We are also hopeful that there will be innovations. Some innovations will emerge that will basically help society to move towards inclusive forms of political participation. Rural residents, particularly women, people with disabilities, and in particular, women with disabilities and young people, they are likely to be reached if more and relevant innovations that are effective are used to reach them, to encourage and promote participation in political life. And I think that finally, it is important that South Africa adopts the CEDAW's General Recommendation 40. This is ongoing work through which the UN, the Secretary General, is trying to facilitate a process whereby countries can contribute to decisions around making equal and inclusive representation of women in decision-making systems more accessible and enhance it. This is an ongoing process that will be concluded in October this year when this General Recommendation 40 will be adopted. It will be important for South Africa, next slide please, to embrace this recommendation and basically support the fact that there is a need to transform governance, and the general recommendation is meant to facilitate that. What is also important in closing is that, as it was indicated earlier, it is not possible for a specific sector to be burdened or be expected to drive this change that we are all aspiring for. It is important for South Africa to adopt a whole society approach to tackling inequality in political participation and to promote representation of women in political life. And it will be critical for South Africa also to embrace the CEDAW Committee's General Recommendation 40, because there is an understanding that we have reached a point where it is clear that traditional patriarchal model of governance is not helpful, and it is not helpful to address a variety of challenges that are facing societies, including South Africa today. Program Director, thank you very much, and we wish this collaboration the best as you continue with other webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vokato, for those wonderful reflections. I'm sure everyone enjoyed. And I would also like to thank the Academy of Science South Africa and the Human Sciences Research Council for entrusting me with this role, and for you colleagues to hold my hand as I held my breath through the flu. Definitely the work has not stopped. We are going to continue. Definitely, I always like to say, ours is a struggle of memory against forgetting, that we must continue to fight. Thank you, colleagues. Have a great afternoon.